Okay, y'all, we're going to get started. So I'm going to, first of all, welcome you all. So good morning. My name is Tiffany Quarles, and I would like to welcome you all to the Lineage, Equity, and Advancement Project's official UN side event for the third session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. Today's topic is Recognition and Reparations, Charting a Lineage-Based Future of Justice for Descendants of Africans Enslaved in the U.S. LEAP, we are a LA-based grassroots organization that has been at the forefront of advocating for reparations at the local, state, and federal level for Black Americans who descend from Africans enslaved in the U.S. LEAP worked with our California State Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, in 2020 on crafting AB 3121, the first in the United States to establish a reparations task force to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. Since the completion of the task force, we have continued our advocacy by championing lineage-based reparations and other reparatory justice policies. So I'd like to introduce our team. We have our co-chair, Lori Jenkins, our treasurer and board member, Marcus Champion, our spokesperson, Chad Brown, and board member, Juanita Watson. And today we have special guest, Kamilah Moore, who's the chair of the California Reparations Task Force, who will give a presentation, and then we will have a brief panel. And finally, we will open the floor for Q&A. But now we will start off our program with the African American National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, performed by LEAP board member Juanita Watson. Then our spokesperson, Chad Brown, will introduce our topic and guest speakers. So thank you all for attending.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies, and let it resound loud as the roaring seas. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun of our new day begun. And let us march on till victory is won.
Tiff. Oh no, Chad.
Okay. Welcome everyone. Just a quick note, we are working on opening up the chat functionality. Please be patient with us as we
got it. It's open now.
Okay, perfect. Well, greetings to the international community, to our brothers and sisters, both domestically and abroad, and to allies around the world. My name is Chad Brown, and I'm the national spokesperson for the Lineage, Equity, and Advancement Project, or LEAP, based in Los Angeles, California. It is a high honor for me to be here with you today to introduce our keynote speaker for this event, Kamilah V. Moore, Esquire. Kamilah Moore is a reparatory justice scholar and an attorney with a specialization in entertainment and intellectual property law. As a law student, Moore contributed to human rights reports related to domestic and international human rights issues, including but not limited to racial inequality in Brazil, the human right to sanitation in Lowndes County, Alabama, USA, and the human right to remedy for Indigenous Black women affected by racialized gender violence in Papua New Guinea. While studying abroad at the University of Amsterdam, Moore wrote a master thesis exploring the intersections between international law and reparatory justice for the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and their legacies. She earned a Juris Doctor degree from Columbia Law School in New York City, a Master of Laws degree in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam, and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Kamilah Moore was appointed to the California Reparations Task Force in 2021. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our esteemed scholar, advocate, and justice champion, and a friend, Ms. Kamilah V. Moore.
Hello, and welcome to the official side event, Reparations and Recognition, charting a lineage-based future for descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. Thank you to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, third session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, with the theme of the session being the Second International Decade for People of African Descent, addressing systemic racism, reparatory justice, and sustainable development. This side event is sponsored by the Lineage Equity and Advancement Project. Again, welcome to the Recognition and Reparations official side event, charting a lineage-based future of justice for descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States. Now, this event is a pivotal convergence of minds, hearts, and intentions toward addressing the historical and ongoing impacts of slavery on African American communities. Specifically, we're talking about on descendants of enslaved Africans forced to labor in the United States. We stand at the crossroads of history and opportunity, aiming to illuminate the path toward reparative justice and equality through legislative action, cultural recognition, and sustainable development. Our gathering today, again sponsored by LEAP, marks a significant step in our collective journey towards healing, understanding, and action. Join us as we delve into the profound significance of lineage in the reparations discourse, explore landmark legislative efforts like California's Reparations Task Force, and celebrate the rich cultural heritage of African American communities. Together, we chart a course towards a future where justice, recognition, and reparation are not just ideals, but actual realities, again, specifically for descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States. A little bit about me. My name is Kamilah Victoria Moore, and I serve as the chairperson of the California Reparations Task Force. I use my experience, my legal training as leverage to be on the task force. For instance, I graduated from Columbia Law School, where I participated in activities like the Human Rights Clinic and the Human Rights Law Review. But I also went to Amsterdam Law School and received a Master of Laws in International Criminal Law, where I also wrote a master thesis on global reparatory justice for people of African descent. I'm focusing on African Americans, Black Brazilians, and Black Colombians. Now, on the agenda today, we're going to have a conversation on cultural recognition, on the history of lineage-based reparations advocacy in the U.S., on California's recent lineage-based efforts in the legislature as well, and then we'll have a discussion and some questions and answers. So let's just get straight into the presentation. Let's first start with addressing one of the themes for this session, which is culture and recognition, right? And I first also want to appreciate that, African Americans, our specific community, we have been labeled so many different things during our time in the United States, from slave, right? 3/5 of a person, to Negro, to Black, to African American, to Black American, to mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, right? We have been classified in numerous ways, probably more than any other ethnic group in the United States. And so naturally, not everyone in our group agrees with what do we call ourselves, right? And I just want to appreciate that. But I also, in terms of this presentation, we want to focus on this term, African American. We want to make a case, and that case is that, this term African American is more than a demographic label. It's a testament to a unique lineage and cultural heritage that demands official recognition. Such recognition is essential for acknowledging the historical injustices faced by descendants of enslaved Africans and for celebrating their contributions to American society. Aligning with the UN Permanent Forum themes, the identity and culture embedded within the term African American resonate with this year's theme of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, Culture and Recognition. It highlights the imperative to officially recognize African American as an identity that embodies a distinct culture, history, and political legacy. This recognition is a critical step towards justice, equality, and the fulfillment of human rights for descendants of enslaved Africans forced to labor in the United States. Again, this term African American encapsulates a profound historical journey from the early post-revolutionary era in the United States to present day. It symbolizes a distinct cultural and political identity grounded in the shared history of enslavement, resistance, and triumph of people of African descent, specifically those who are forced to labor in the United States. Beginning in 1782, which I'll show you, evolving through the post-Reconstruction era and gaining significant momentum during and even after the Civil Rights Movement, this term African American has served a powerful identifier. It asserts a dual heritage and a resilience in the face of systemic oppression. Each phase of its evolution underscores a growing consciousness and demand for recognition and rights. So here are some visuals that I would like to show you. Starting in 1782, you see, a pamphlet of a free, a Black American calling himself by an African American, calling himself an African American in a sermon that he wrote. In these visuals, 1898 and 1899. Are visuals from the National Afro-American Council, right? A group of prominent African Americans like Booker T. Washington coming together, organizing, for instance, to stop lynchings in the United States is one of their calls. In 1968, you see a pamphlet by Queen Mother Audley Moore, who we'll learn a little bit more about. And on the left, you see the term reparations, for African Americans. And so we see African American being used as a distinct political and historical identifier, tracing all the way back to the 18th century, to say 1782. Also, Martha S. Jones has a really great book called Birthright Citizens that talks about how African American activists remade national belonging through battles in legislatures, conventions, and courthouses, essentially securing what is now known to be birthright citizenship, right? Not only for themselves, but obviously for what became all people who would become U.S. citizens under the 14th Amendment. And as these visuals illustrate, as I said, right, even starting in 1782, the use of terms of African American begins to take shape, reflecting early assertions of identity beyond the conditions of enslavement, right? This period sets the groundwork for the recognition of African descendants as a distinct group within American society, starting the journey towards political and cultural recognition, again, as early as 1782. And then in 1898, with the National Afro-American Council, right, amidst the aftermath of the Reconstruction era, the short-lived Reconstruction era, and the rise of Black codes and Jim Crow laws, you had the African-American community via the Afro-American Council, for instance, solidifying its identity, using shared terms of identification as a form of resistance and self-definition, right? This era marks a pivotal moment in the development of a collective identity that is both a political stance and a reflection of shared historical experiences. Same in 1899 as well with the same organization, right? It gained intellectual and cultural footing, right, with the establishment of organizations like the National Afro-American Council, or even previously like the African Methodist Church, that underscore the African heritage and American experience of this community. These organizations play a crucial role in promoting cultural recognition, education, and the political rights of African Americans. And in 1968, you see with that pamphlet, right? You see this term, particularly after the Civil Rights Movement, starting to become more embraced. It signifies reclaiming of identity and declaration of pride in being of African heritage, but also being prideful in being an American citizen, and aligning that closely with the themes of culture and recognition. And so on being African American, one of the expert witnesses from the California Reparations Task Force was Isabel Wilkerson. And Isabel Wilkerson talked about the African American experience, and stating that the experience is defined by more than race. We also have to talk about caste. For instance, she went to India, where they also have a caste system, and she told that audience that she had written a 600-page book about the Jim Crow era in the United States and the American South, the time of naked white supremacy, but that the word racism actually didn't appear anywhere in that 600-page book. How is that? Right? She told them that after spending 15 years studying the topic and hearing the testimony of the survivors of the era, she realized that that term wasn't sufficient, right? Caste was more of an accurate term to describe the African American experience. And we'll learn a little bit more why. Again, these are quotes from her book. Race is insufficient, again, to really encapsulate the African American experience. According to Isabel Wilkerson, in America, race is the primary tool and the visible decoy, the front man for what lies underneath, which is more sinister, which is caste. She states, while this book seeks to consider the effects on everyone caught in this caste hierarchy, the book devotes significant attention to the poles, right? The polar opposites of the American caste system. Those at the top, which are European Americans who have been its primary beneficiaries, and those at the bottom, particularly African Americans, those who are descendants of enslaved Africans born in the United States, forced to labor in the United States, against the caste system has directed its full powers of dehumanization. And Isabel Wilkerson's theory around the African American experience, I guess you could say, transcending race in a sinister way to also at the element of caste, it actually does track. If you look at the legal case Dred Scott versus Sanford, again, this was an infamous ruling where the United States Supreme Court stated that enslaved people were not citizens of the United States. When most people are asked, what was Dred Scott v. Sanford about, or what did the court hold? What did the court decide? Many people kind of oversimplify the holding and say, oh, the court said that Black people couldn't be citizens. But that actually doesn't tell the full story about what the court was actually contemplating. And the court was very clear in telling us what the court wanted to contemplate. And I'm going to read an excerpt of the question that the court was aiming to contemplate. And it's very clear and specific in terms of the group they were intending to question their citizenship. The question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community? Let's play that back. can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed to the citizen, one of which rights is the privilege of suing in a court. It goes on to say, Chief Justice Taney, it will be observed that the plea applies to that class of persons only whose ancestors were Negroes of the African race and imported into this country and sold and held as slaves. The court continues to double down in articulating and defining the group that they're contemplating, whether this group can ever become citizens. They go on to say, again, the only matter and issue before the court, therefore, is whether the descendants of such slaves, right, that would be me and other descendants of enslaved Africans forced to labor in the United States, when they shall be emancipated or who are born of parents who had become free before their birth, are citizens of a state, in the sense in which the word citizen is used in the Constitution of the United States. And this being the only matter, again, they're doubling down again on this group, in dispute on the pleadings. The court must be understood. The court must be understood as speaking in this opinion of that class only. That is, of those persons who are descendants of Africans who were imported into this country and sold as slaves. So now when people ask, what was Dred Scott v. Sanford about? Because broadly speaking, right, but that's kind of an injurious framework to say broadly speaking, it was about whether Black people could ever be citizens in this country. That's kind of injurious because you see the Supreme Court was going out of their way to really define what and who this case was truly about. This case was truly about whether African Americans specifically, whether descendants of enslaved Africans forced to labor in the United States specifically, could ever be truly deemed to be citizens of the United States. And that tracks because that's what this reparations movement is all about. It's a political project to perfect truly our rights, our constitutional and human rights, right? To perfect the ability to truly benefit from all of the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed to the citizen. And this is the Dred Scott case. It goes on, I'll just be brief, in juxtaposing, right, the position of African Americans to, for instance, Native Americans. And Chief Justice Taney says, the situation of this population of African Americans is altogether unlike that of the Indian race. The latter, the Indian race, it is true, formed no part of the colonial communities and never amalgamated with them in social connections or in government, but although they were uncivilized, they were yet a free and independent people, associated together in nations and tribes. They go on to say that the United States treated, Indian governments as foreign governments, right? And for instance, at the bottom of the paragraphs, it says, but, these Indians, they may without doubt, like the subjects of any other foreign government, be naturalized easily by the authority of Congress and become citizens of a state and of the United States. And if an individual should leave his nation or tribe and take up his abode among the white population, he would be entitled to all the rights and privileges which would belong to an immigrant from any other foreign people. But again, right, going back to the central question of Dred Scott v. Sanford, you have the court saying, the history of enslaved Africans and their descendants is altogether different from even Native Americans and, any other, to an immigrant from any other foreign people, in that our citizenship rights are automatically suspect and called into question. And so that's where the kind of the history of lineage-based reparations advocacy in a sense, also takes its root. You have ex-slaves like Callie House, born in 1861 in Tennessee, created one of the largest, if not the largest to date, national reparations movement. Mary Berry has a book on her called My Face is Black is True. Callie House defied societal conventions and led an organization called the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, one of the largest grassroots movements in African American history. She tirelessly traveled the country, organizing newly freed African Americans in the quest to right the wrongs of slavery. A lot of people don't know, actually, Callie House, she was charged with mail fraud by the United States government. They accused her of defrauding other ex-slaves, selling them a pipe dream, and advocating for reparations. The FBI and the U.S. Postal Office said, and so they charged her with mail fraud. An all-white male jury convicted her of mail fraud, and she was convicted and served a year in prison. And ultimately, she died of cervical cancer. And so she wasn't able to see, obviously, her reparations advocacy become successful as her organization was dismantled by her incarceration. And notably, I also want to talk about Johnson v. McAdoo, which is a class action, a court case that Callie House actually brought. For instance, in 1915, it was a U.S. federal court. They filed a case in U.S. federal court seeking reparations for slavery in the amount of $68 million, the amount of cotton tax that was collected between 1862 and 1868. Since its collection in the 1860s, the tax money was just held by the Treasury Department for the next 50 years without distribution due to issues regarding the appropriateness of collecting the tax on cotton produced by slaves. And so recognizing that the $68 million had no takers for the prior 50 years, you had Callie House and her partner, Isaiah H. Dickerson, campaign for reparation for slavery based on the $68 million. They sought to have a court order to get the Treasury Department to perform the specific act of giving the $68 million back to the plaintiff class that made up of descendants of slaves and former slaves as being a fair resolution to the lawsuit. Unfortunately, the lawsuit was unsuccessful. As the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with the decision by the Court of Appeals, saying that there was governmental immunity, right? That you can sue the government without their consent, which is really unfortunate. But Johnson v. McAdoo was actually the first documented chattel slavery reparations litigation in the U.S. at the federal level. Again, brought by folks like Callie House, actual ex-slaves, African Americans. And then you have, for instance, the history of lineage-based reparations extends right to historic figures like Queen Mother Ali Moore, who created the Reparations Committee for United States slave descendants in 1962. Or, for instance, the third point in the Black Panther Party's 10-point program was all about reparations, right? It says, we want 40 acres and 2 mules, right? The initial concept was 40 acres and 1 mule. The Black Panther Party said, we want 2 mules as back pay. So the third point was all about reparations for slavery. And so in this next part and last part of this conversation, I want to talk a bit about the California Reparations Task Force, which I was the chair of, but I want to talk about what has come out of this task force, which is some very prominent and substantive legislation that is lineage-based, that is narrowly tailored to descendants of enslaved Africans forced to labor in the United States. And it's unprecedented because of that. No other state has done this, has had specific, narrowly tailored legislation for descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. So we are really, in the state of California, really pioneering on this issue, which completely aligns, again, with the themes of culture and recognition, as well as the other themes as well. And so The task force is based on a bill called AB 3121, is a legislative bill that passed the state assembly in the Senate, and our California governor signed it into law in 2020. If you read the bill, it has language that affirms, right, descendants of enslaved Africans born in the United States, right? More than 4 million Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States. You have language in the statute. The task force had to study, right, and identify and compile data on federal and state laws that discriminated against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants who were deemed United States citizens from 1868, which is the year of the 14th Amendment, to present. We had to, talk about the legacy of slavery on living African Americans. Again, this is all language from the statute that created the task force. Why emphasis on living African Americans? Again, this goes to the history of reparations advocacy in the United States and the intersection between that and international law, right? You have people like William Patterson, Paul Robeson charging the United States with genocide for failing to prevent the lynching of African Americans, right? Talking about the elements of genocide as well are relevant to this discussion and as it relates to African Americans. And so also the task force, in the bill that created the task force, it stated that our recommendations had to, comport with international human rights law standards. Any of the proposals that we came up with after, studying all the atrocities endured by African Americans, they had to comport with these international human rights law standards. As you all know, under international law, there are 5 forms of reparations: compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So the task force, our final report, we covered the 12 major areas of systemic discrimination that still persist in the society and still negatively impact descendants of enslaved Africans born in the United States, forced to labor in the United States. And that includes, for instance, racial terror, political disenfranchisement, housing segregation, separate and unequal education, racism in the environment and infrastructure, pathologizing of the Black family, control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life, stolen labor and hindered opportunity, the unjust legal system, mental and physical harm and neglect. See what's etched on that table of white medical students dissecting an African American woman. Her loss is our gain. And the wealth gap, with white households owning 9 times more assets than African American households. And so the task force, we recommended over 115 recommendations to eradicate these lingering badges and incidents of slavery for descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. And so what now? So you have the California Legislative Black Caucus and other legislators introducing reparations legislation based on the task force's recommendations. In fact, there are about 19 different reparations bills that are out right now based on the task force's recommendation. For the purposes of time and for focus, I'm going to share a bit about the lineage-based reparations bills that are out right now. Like AB 3152, that would levy an excise tax on products historically tied to slave labor like wine, cotton, gold, and tobacco, which would fund housing loans and education grants for descendants of slaves. Or SB 1403, that would create a new state agency just for descendants of slaves with the genealogy office to help trace lineage as well, and would implement and monitor the reparations legislation that passes. Or SB 1013, that would provide property tax relief to descendants of slaves. And SB 1007, that would provide grants for home ownership support for first-time home buyers or existing home owners for mortgage assistance and homeowners insurance, again, for descendants of slaves. and SB 1331 that would create a new state fund, again, just for descendants of slaves. And many of these bills haven't had their hearings yet, but many of them have had committee hearings, and they've been successful and have passed through some of their first stages of the committee hearings. This is great news and precedent-setting work. I'm looking forward to having a robust discussion and answering any questions. So in closing, let's take a moment to acknowledge the profound duty we carry. This gathering is more than a conversation. It's a step towards healing and centuries of injustice. As we commit to the cause of descendants of Africans forced to labor in the United States, we're not just looking back, we're really moving forward. Together towards a future of recognition and reparative justice. So thank you for being an integral part of this movement.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation, Chair Moore. So right now we're going to have our short panel discussion. I'm going to introduce our participants here. So with us, as you just heard, is the former chair of the California Reparations Task Force, Kamilah Moore. And then also joining us is the co-chair of the Lineage, Equity, and Advancement Project, Tiffany Quarles. And then our spokesperson, national spokesperson, Chad Brown. And, just want to say, these are colleagues of mine. We've been working together now about 5 years. These aren't just my colleagues. These are my brothers and sisters. This is my family. So let's go ahead and get started with the panel. So the first question I have, and I'm going to come to you first, Chair Moore, is how do you think the international community can assist with the African-American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, also known as American freedmen? How can the international community assist in those reparations efforts?
Yes. Thank you for having me. To answer the first question.
We can barely hear you, Chair Moore.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Sound like you're far away.
If you may have
It might be if you're using a headset, it might be a headset.
Can you hear me now?
No, you're still far away.
Yeah, you might have to take it off of Bluetooth.
Yeah. I'm gonna come back to you, Chair Moore. I'm gonna go to you.
Is that better?
Yeah, better now. Better now. So
okay. Yes. So thank you for the question. I think first it starts with just simple acknowledgement, harkening back to the theme of the session. One of the themes of the session this year, which is culture and recognition. That's actually a gift that we really need. It's just a simple acknowledgement of our identity. And that really sets the foundation for, hopefully what looks like, allyship, people of African descent across the Americas, coming together to unite with us for our specific fight for lineage-based reparations for descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. And it's also in the spirit of, I meant to say this in the presentation, Malcolm X, the late Malcolm X, one of the last organization that he created before his assassination. Actually, he was giving a speech about this organization right before he was assassinated, was, the creation of the Organization for Afro-American Unity. And that was an organization that Malcolm X created because he understood that, before, African Americans could really unite and work with the African Union, right? It was important for African Americans to work amongst themselves for their specific political projects. But then it was also first important to also reach out to, people of African descent across the Americas, for instance, in Brazil, Colombia, the Caribbean, seeing how we can help each other with, our respective and unique political fights. And then once, we're strong in those fights, then coming together with the African continent. So, Malcolm X, even in the 60s, had the strategic vision, I would say, that I think, the UN in this session that conclude, right, to support each other in our unique political projects, wherever we are in our regions, but then also coming together to
You're breaking up a little bit, Kamilah. Were you finished? All right, so I'm gonna go to Tiffany or Chad. Anything you want to add to that question?
Just briefly, I think Kamilah got it perfect. I think the international community, thank you for those who are here from the international community, could help by, like Kamilah said, supporting, especially what we're doing here in California. California is the largest state in the United States in terms of population. It's also the fourth largest economy in the world. So if we're successful here, that puts pressure on the federal government, because that is the main goal, is for the U.S. government to enact reparations policies. And we get that done in California. It, like I said, set a template for the federal government, and that would only help our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, as well as Africa and other places such as Brazil and Europe, who are fighting for reparations as well. So what we're doing here in California is of the utmost importance. So if you are viewing us from somewhere in the Caribbean or Africa, and you have your own reparations organization or movement, please continue to stay in contact with us and support us, because like I said, what we're doing here is being watched by the federal government. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Before I go to the next question, Chad, anything you want to add?
No, I think Tiffany and Kamilah buttoned that one up pretty nicely.
All right, excellent. All right, so our next question is going to be, what pushback have you observed or received, or what misconceptions have you observed against Black Americans since this lineage-specific mindset shift has occurred? And I'm gonna go to Tiffany first on that question. What misconceptions or pushback have you observed?
The main misconception is that focusing on our specific claim, our lineage, is divisive, and that it's harmful to other Black people. But that's actually the quite opposite, because first of all, any group of people should be recognized. I believe it's a human rights violation to not recognize a specific group, and that's what we're arguing in the context of reparations, that Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in this nation are a specific group. And so reparations only, in my opinion, strengthens that claim. And so some have misunderstood that it's, against the spirit of Pan-Africanism, that it's, like I said, divisive, but no, it's actually strengthening our claim here in the US, considering that our Constitution is set up where you can't do policies based on race. So the best way forward for us to be successful is to focus on lineage versus race. So once again, if we're successful here, that would only help other countries. So yes, thank you. That concludes my answer.
Chad, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Tiffany's response. We are all firm believers that justice domestically for African-American descendants of persons enslaved will beget justice throughout the world. I think we see historically examples of that when we look at the civil rights movement and how that influenced the ending of apartheid in South Africa. Some of the greatest pushback that I really have seen here domestically is that, what we've come to realize is that there are institutions that have been built to prevent us from reaching the goal of reparations and economic justice specifically for our community. And so those institutions span across political spaces, communications and media spaces, as well as advocacy spaces. And so I was, quite frankly, surprised at the depth and the breadth of a lot of the opposition that has been placed in front of us to suppress the movement and suppress the messaging that we have obviously been pushing now for over 5 years. So I would ask the international community to recognize also that while we are, battling very, very real political opposition, we are also battling very real media opposition, very real opposition to, as Tiffany mentioned, to the recognition of us as a unique and specific people group. So that's really kind of the pushback. And I think Tiffany, nailed it, but I did want to mention some of the institutional opposition that we've run up against.
Excellent, excellent. Chair Moore, is there anything you want to add to that question? All right, before I go to the next question, I'll just say, just to add my 2 cents on that, I got to recognize Dr. Jovan Scott Lewis, who was also a commissioner for the California Reparations Task Force. He is a Jamaican native. And one thing he said was, it stuck out to me one of the times we met with him, was that true Pan-Africanism is not just the diaspora coming together, but it's a recognition of the individual cultures within the diaspora. And so for us to, in this process, I've seen it's as if we're supposed to deny that. And, I look at that as a continuance of the oppression that we've received in this country. And so again, to be a true Pan-Africanist, to really walk in the spirit of Pan-Africanism is a recognition of and celebration of the individual cultures. And I think that's something that we've done, over the past 5 years, is really start to make that a priority amongst our folks here in America, the Black Americans, African American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. We make that a priority because we have a rich history here, despite how we got here. We have a rich history here. And as we say, we built this country and we stand on that. All right. And so going to our final question, and I'm going to come to you first, Chad.
Okay.
It's going to be, what steps would you like to see the United Nations take to support reparations efforts happening in America as well as California?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Marcus. I guess my answer would harken back to 2001 and the Durban World Conference that the UN hosted in Durban, South Africa. Coming out of that World Conference, the UN put forward a declaration and program of action. And in that declaration and program of action, they recognized that apartheid and genocide constitute crimes against humanity and affirmed that wherever and whenever they occurred, they must be condemned and their recurrence prevented. The UN also urged states to reinforce protection against racism, racial discrimination by ensuring that all persons have access to effective and adequate remedies and enjoy the right to seek from national tribunals and institutions just and adequate reparation and satisfaction for any damage as a result of such discrimination. And further, the UN urged states to adopt the necessary measures as provided by national law to ensure the right of victims to seek just and adequate reparation and satisfaction, to redress acts of racism, racial discrimination, and to design effective measures to prevent the repetition of such acts. What the international community and the UN must recognize is that there is an active ethnocide and genocide occurring against African American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States right now. The United States continues to deny its culpability in the transatlantic slave trade and domestic chattel enslavement of African Americans, and continues to skirt its responsibility to make that same group whole through compensatory reparations. In fact, the U.S. has rather taken visible steps in policy and law to erase our group from the social, political, and economic landscape of the nation. That is where I think the UN is needed, to compel the cessation of the genocide occurring in the U.S. and to compel the repayment of the inheritance that's been stolen from the descendants of those Africans enslaved in America.
Thank you for that answer, Chad. I'm going to go to Chair Moore. Is there anything you want to add to that question? All right, Tiffany, anything you want to add?
No, he summed it up perfectly. Like I said, the UN, we have a long history as African Americans as going to the UN, such as we charge genocide, to discuss what Chad just said. And it would be great if the UN could play a role in acknowledging and recognizing African Americans here in the United States as a specific group. So that's one thing I would like to see, and also their support for what we're doing here in California.
Excellent, excellent. And I just want to thank my brothers and sisters for this panel. With that, we're going to go into our final segment. I'm going to pass it to my brother Chad. We're going to have our Q&A session. So Chad, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. I see several questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many of these questions as we can. Please continue to put them in the chat as thoughts come to you and you want to ask a question. So the very first one that I see here is for you, Chair Moore. And the question was, could you speak about the recent oral arguments for the 1921 Tulsa race massacre case as it relates to reparatory justice and reparations?
Yes, I am trying to get off our play. Yes. So So yes, so recently on April 2nd, you had the living survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre. They had their chance to hear their case in court. Again, they're being represented by a private law firm called Schulte, Roth, and Zabel, also by attorney Demario Solomon Simmons. And basically, this law firm, they've created a really novel argument to try to get justice for these living descendants. But not only, these two direct living descendants, but also, their descendants, African Americans living in Tulsa, essentially stating that the Tulsa Race Massacre constituted what's called a public nuisance that is still affecting the city of Greenwood, Tulsa, to this day. And so in terms of, what the defendants, the city of Tulsa, they're obviously not trying to give justice to, these descendants. And, they're making arguments, for instance, that, the city of Tulsa, to the extent that it's blighted today, was not blighted because of the Tulsa Race Massacre, but was blighted due to, for instance, urban renewal that came well after the Tulsa Race Massacre. Again, they're just trying to, dismiss this case on, technical and procedural grounds, such as this, without obviously acknowledging the fact that, the city of Tulsa existed at the time of this massacre, right? The sheriff's department that, allowed for the mob to destroy the city still exists, right? All of the actors that allowed for this race massacre in terms of the institutions in Tulsa still exist to this day. And that's also what, the attorneys for the descendants are also arguing as well. The one last point I'll mention is, after the oral arguments on April 2nd, we won't know, the judges, there's no time limit for the Tulsa Supreme Court to get back to the descendants to, tell them whether or not their case will be allowed to proceed to the discovery phase. That is obviously what attorney Demario Solomon Simmons and Schulte, Roth, and Zabel want, right? They want the judges to say, and there's 9 judges, so 5 of them, it has to be a majority. 5 of the judges have to agree to allow for the case to proceed to discovery and then to trial. That's obviously what they want. Demario Solomon Simmons told the court, if you all just allow us to get to the discovery phase, we can answer all of these questions that you all might have about this case and about our legal theory, right? Don't allow the defendants to tell you, for instance, that you can't, redress these victims because, for instance, that's not even the question yet, right? We're in the pleading stage. Allow us to plead our case in, through discovery and then trial. And then you can reach the question of, whether redress through the courts are deserved, but please allow us to have our day in court. So that's essentially what is essentially happening. And we'll see, hopefully in the next coming months or so, in the next month or so, what the Tulsa Supreme Court decides.
Thank you for that, Chair Moore. Next question, and I think Tiffany, as one of our community organizers extraordinaire, I think this is a good one for you. What actions can people take in the community to spread this message better in 2024?
Thank you. My response is to get involved with your local reparations group, or if you're joining us in the international community, you ask that question, just get involved with CARICOM of the African Union here in the States. There's several groups on the ground. That is the most impactful way. You do have a robust community on social media that advocates for reparations, but in person, there's nothing that beats talking to the community in person, working with your elected officials. That's something anyone could do. That's what we did. Just as people, regular people, just start talking to the elected, our local politicians, our state politicians, our federal politicians about this issue. And that's democracy in action, just everyday people getting involved with the government and, encouraging them to write policy and legislation. So
Yeah,
Right.
thank you, Tiffany. I would also add to that answer, connect with LEAP, the Lineage Equity and Advancement Project. We have been working on this issue now for the past 5 years. And as you see in California, we have very important legislation moving. We see California as setting the template and the model for the federal government. So engaging in California and the legislative fight that we are currently in is also engaging in the federal fight from our perspective. So I would say become more aware of what's happening and occurring presently in the state of California and get engaged, as you heard Tiffany say. All right, and to our next question, and I think we have just a few more minutes here, so we'll try to be brief. But could any panelist speak to how advocacy for reparations may link with the proposed draft United Nations Declaration on the promotion, protection, and full respect of the human rights of people of African descent? And that's for anyone. Kamilah, as our resident
Well, I
international.
would just say, I think, our plight, as descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States, it should be, that's part of the demand, that fits within the themes of this year's session, culture and recognition, our plight, that should be included, in that declaration. And that's extremely important. In California Reparations Task Force, for instance, of our many recommendations, but most notably, I want to lift up some of the bills from the state legislators, and in terms of strategy, right? Some of the first bills that got committee hearings were the acknowledgement bills, right? The bills that forced the state to acknowledge the harms done to descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. And then building on top of that, some of the first committee hearings were, the apology bills, right? Having the state formally apologize, right? After they formally acknowledge the harm, right? Then you have to formally apologize for it. And then, the more substantive bills, are built off on top of that. And so, I think generally speaking that also needs to happen on a federal level, right? Acknowledgement, apology, and then the more substantive bills. But then also it would be great to have that similar acknowledgement on an international level through that declaration.
Couldn't agree more. Tiffany, Marcus, anything to add there? All right, we'll move on to the next question here. Is there any work being done to strategize around protecting people and assets once the reparations debt is finally honored? Tulsa and many other places illustrate the backlash that should be anticipated.
Well, I'll take a stab at this one. Part of the areas of restitution, guarantees of non-repetition is one of the tenets of the UN or international law for reparations. So the guarantees of non-repetition, I believe, would cover that, but we definitely need to advocate for policies that do protect us. That's one of the things that we do advocate for at LEAP is protections against harms for us. So
absolutely. Federal protections are a must for our community. Okay, next question. And Lori, please keep me honest on time. What is the timeline for reparations milestones for this project? And this person recommends a multi-generational approach. As such, promotion and funding for prenatal health care and foster care for the identified community. So that question seems to ask, what is our timeline or what is our expectation for reparations here in California and then federally? Anyone want to tackle that?
I guess I would say, just from my perspective, what I've seen so far, this is pretty much a ongoing fight for the foreseeable future. Where we are in California, we're at the phase of, we're trying to get the agency together. If you know the history of reparations, whether it be, after the Holocaust or Japanese reparations, there was a state-sponsored office, in the case of Japanese reparations, a federal office that facilitated the reparations process. And so for us out here, that bill is on the floor right now in the California legislature to pass through. But one thing, and I give credit to Chair Moore because this was her recommendation during the task force process, it was that office to facilitate reparations similar to the Japanese, but she expanded on it so much more and included so many more functions for that office to tackle, including genealogy, administering benefits like cash benefits, medical benefits, educational benefits, as well as other things. And so that's where we are right now, as well as Senator Bradford, who was a sponsor of that bill, also has a bill, which you saw in Chair Moore's presentation. He has a bill to create a funding source for all reparations programs that are going to happen in the foreseeable future. In terms of a timeline, I can't give you a timeline. We've been doing this now. We got together back in 2019. And so we're going on 5 years now since we've been in this fight. I think we're ahead of schedule compared to where we started in terms of where we thought we would be today. We have actual bills on the floor, notwithstanding the task force that's already happened, which, just 10 years ago, people thought was a dream or something like that. So I think we're ahead of schedule. I can't tell you an exact timeline as to how things are going to go. I just know this is where we're focused right now to see what's there with Senator Bradford's bills to make sure that all those pass in this cycle and to get better legislation and build on it as time goes on.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, Marcus. I'll just add from a timeline perspective, as soon as possible, and we will fight as long as it takes. Next question. Is there an initiative to develop a descendants congregation caucus to have a community of legal professionals to represent descendants on federal, state, and local levels? And I guess, Kamilah, since you are a resident attorney, would you like to tackle that one?
Sorry. Okay, I did not hear the question, but I'm going to the Q&A right now because
Not
I
a problem.
assume
No, I
it's
can
written.
repeat it for you here. Is
Oh,
there
I see.
is there an initiative to develop a descendants congregation caucus to have a committee
It's
of
congressional, Chad, is what she meant to type.
congressional, sorry, congressional caucus to have a committee of legal professionals to represent descendants on federal, state, and local levels?
Oh, wow. No, that's a really good idea. As far as from my knowledge, my best knowledge, I'm not aware that that exists. But that question does remind me actually of an article that Nicole Hannah-Jones recently published via New York Times Magazine. Essentially about, partly about the history of affirmative action, about, what's happening now with the attack on, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Like, for instance, yesterday, I believe, news came out that Duke University, in light of, the Supreme Court of the United States striking down race-conscious affirmative action under a diversity rationale, they are now getting rid of their, full ride scholarship program named after a Black student who died in a car accident or in some type of accident in Duke, but the recipients were Black students. They announced that they are getting rid of that program, which is really, really unfortunate. And that's what's happening across the country. You're seeing, all of these programs, based on race, as and intersecting with diversity, equity, and inclusion being challenged. And so, in Nicole Hannah-Jones' article, which really tracks again with what lineage-based reparations advocates have been kind of championing for years now, she, brought this message essentially, to a more mainstream audience as of recent, with this particular article as it relates to DEI, pretty much stating in her conclusion that, these programs are going to have to become lineage-based, right? They're going to have to be nearly tailored to serve descendants of slaves, but also to directly confront these institutions' history of institutional discrimination against our particular group for them to withstand scrutiny from the courts. And in fact, she just tweeted that this morning, right, in response to Duke University getting rid of its Black Scholarship program. She tweeted verbatim, right, these programs are going to have to be tailored to descendants of slaves for them to survive, right? And it's not just because it is not just changing Black to descendants of slaves. That's not, that's not in and of itself it's not like, that's the magic wand necessarily that's needed and now all is well, right? What's really important, right, again, is for these programs to be nearly tailored to the descendants of slaves. However, instead of basing these programs on a diversity rationale, you need to base them on, right, these institutions needing to remedy descendants of slaves discrimination. I'll conclude by saying Duke University, right, has a long history of not admitting Black American students who descend from slaves in their institution, right? It was segregated, right? Well, during slavery, we weren't allowed to go to Duke at all, right? Because we weren't allowed to be educated, right? And during segregation, we weren't allowed to go to Duke at all either because, it was segregated. And so, these institutions really only opened up to African Americans, in the 1970s. And, that and an affirmative action on a remedial basis only lasted for a generation and only really affected the baby boomers. So African Americans who are Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alphas, we haven't benefited from affirmative action from a remedial basis. And so Nicole Hannah-Jones' point, though, we need to get back to the original framework of affirmative action. And that is, just to conclude, right, nearly tailoring these programs, these initiatives to descendants of slaves and tying that eligibility to these institution-specific acts of discrimination against our group.
Thank you so much for that response, Chair Moore. And we have come to the final question I see here in the Q&A. And I believe we've touched on this previously, but we'll reiterate here. So this question is, how did Marcus Garvey, with his concept of unification of all Negroes, impact the present lineage narrative? And I believe, Tiffany, you might have spoken briefly to this if you want to tackle this one.
Yeah, just to reiterate, all of us, regardless, people of African descent, whether we're in Brazil, the Caribbean, continent of Africa, the United States, we all have our prospective reparations fight. I think this is a ripe opportunity for us to support one another. Like here in the US, we have a very unique situation, and I'm sure there's situations unique to each region. And so unifying across, borders is supporting each other. Like we would love for CARICOM to support what we're doing here in California. We would love for the African Union to support what we're doing here in California and support the lineage decision, because that is what's constitutionally sound and that's the most viable path to this happening. So I think that, this movement, this global movement, is an opportunity for us to unite, but also respect each other's unique situation. So that's my answer.
Thank you so much for that response, Tiffany. That concludes the Q&A portion of this event today. And with that, I'll kick it over to our hero in charge of all things technical, who keeps us together, keeps us running, Lori Jenkins.
Well, before you go to Lori, Chad, can I just mention I will be in Geneva next week. So if you will be there, I'd love to connect with you and hope to see you in Geneva next week.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Along with Juanita Watson.
Thank you for mentioning that, Tiffany. I think that's super exciting that you'll be in Geneva with Nita and able to connect with some of our partners internationally in Switzerland. I think that's incredible. Okay, Lori, take it away.
All right, so we have come to the close of this webinar, and we certainly appreciate those of you that took time out of your busy schedules to join us. We hope that the information that was presented to you has been informative and that we can continue this dialogue in working together to move reparations forward, both here in the United States and abroad. And so with that, I'd like to thank our keynote speaker, Chair Moore, for taking time out of her schedule. I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists, as well as our moderators, for participating today. And as you can see, we have provided a means for you to be able to keep in touch with us. So follow us on social media, register for our mailing list, and let's continue to march this train forward. And with that, we will see you next time.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody. Everybody have a good day, night, morning, wherever you at.
And a great